much for the introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. I told Nick that I'm going to talk fast because given my travel issues. So if I'm talking too fast, will someone just do me a favor and just stand up and say, stop? Anyway, so in some ways I'm an odd speaker at an environmental conference because I'm a longtime business journalist. I worked at Fortune for many years and now write mainly for Vanity Fair. When I set out to write my book about fracking, it was explicitly not an environmental book. It was a book that sought to look at the financial underpinnings of the fracking industry. But the book, I think, is highly relevant to anybody in the environmental movement, and working on it transformed my thinking in some ways, and I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. But I want to start with what people call the Shale Revolution itself, fracking, because it is indisputably changing the world. We've gone from congressional hearings a decade ago about American shortages of oil and natural gas to this widespread belief that we have enough natural gas here to last for 100 years. America is now once again the world's biggest producer of crude oil, topping Saudi Arabia and Russia for the first time since the 1970s. President Trump talks about not just American energy independence, but energy dominance. And all of this is really due to hydraulic fracturing, better known as fracking. I quote an economist in my book saying it's one of the top 5 things reshaping geopolitics. And I've always been a little bit shocked that people haven't cared more about it, that so much of the coverage of our business world focuses on the latest, laundry app to come out of Silicon Valley, when fracking from an environmental standpoint and an economic standpoint, I think matters way more to our future. As a business journalist, I'm also always obsessed with characters, and so my book focuses on a character who has a lot to do with the American fracking revolution, and his name was Aubrey Mcclendon, and he was the CEO of a company called Chesapeake Energy. And love him or hate him, he's one of those larger-than-life characters that makes business stories read like novels. And so I wrote this about Aubrey, that no one was more right and more wrong, bolder in his predictions or more spectacular in his failures, more willing to risk other people's money and his own than Aubrey Mcclendon. He was born in 1959 when American oil still ruled the world, 2 years before OPEC was created. He died in a fiery car crash just 4 months after President Obama lifted the long-standing ban on oil exports, and we're going to come back to why it was President Obama that lifted that ban. I quoted somebody in my book saying he was the good face of the fracking industry, the passion, the creativity, the daring, but he was also the bad face. His death, like his legacy, was a hotly contested subject. On March 2nd, 2016, just after 9 a.m., Aubrey Mcclendon slammed his Chevrolet Tahoe SUV into a bridge on Midwest Boulevard in Oklahoma City, dying instantly. He was speeding, he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and he didn't seem to make any effort to avoid the collision. Just a day earlier, a federal grand jury had indicted Aubrey Mcclendon for violating antitrust laws during his time as the CEO of Chesapeake Energy. Investigators ultimately ruled it an accident, but rumors of suicide persist to this day. As Captain Paco Balderrama of the Oklahoma City Police told the press, "We may never know 100% what happened." In the fall of 2008, Forbes had ranked Aubrey Mcclendon number 134 on its list of the 400 richest Americans, with an estimated net worth of over $3 billion. But because he borrowed so much money and secured business loans with personal guarantees, 2 years after his death, lawyers were still wrangling over the remnants of his estate, trying to figure out which debts would be paid, from the $500,000 he owed the Boy Scouts of America to the $465 million he owed a group of Wall Street creditors, including Goldman Sachs. Wall Street's vultures, hedge funds, that invest in distressed debt had descended, buying the debt for less than 50 cents on the dollar, essentially rendering the verdict that Aubrey Mcclendon's claims weren't going to be paid in full. And I have to admit, all of this gives me a sneaking sympathy for Aubrey Mcclendon, because in my over 2 decades of covering mainly business gone wrong, I've done so many stories about people who have risked other people's money. I've done very few stories about people who have also risked their own money and every penny they had. And there's something admirable in a way about the guy who actually literally goes down with the ship. If McClendon did die broke, it wouldn't have been out of character. During his years as an oil and gas tycoon, he fed on risk, and he was as fearless as he was reckless. He built an empire that at one point produced more natural gas than any American company except ExxonMobil. Once when an investor asked on a conference call, "When is enough?" McClendon answered bluntly, "I can't get enough." Many people think that without Aubrey Mcclendon's salesmanship and his astonishing ability to woo investors, the world would be a far different place today. Stories abound about how at industry conferences, executives from oil majors like Exxon would find themselves speaking to mostly empty seats, while people literally fought for space in the room where McClendon was holding forth. He was just a fantastic salesman. When I started working on my book, I sat down with an investment analyst who was very skeptical about Aubrey Mcclendon and very skeptical about fracking. And this guy said to me, "I never let Aubrey Mcclendon in the room for a meeting, because if we had, I know we would have ended up buying a lot of stock in his company, Chesapeake, and it would not have ended well." He was that good, and it did not end well. I've been fascinated by Aubrey dating all the way back to 2010. A source of mine, a guy who lives in Australia but follows the American oil and gas industry, used to tell me, maybe with some degree of hyperbole, that Aubrey Mcclendon was the most important man in America. And what he meant by that was that if Aubrey really was right, and America was a source of cheap natural gas, and natural gas really was a bridge fuel to a cleaner environment, then it was going to change the shape of American industry going forward. It was going to change the industries that were located here. It was going to change the types of jobs that were going to be here. And that is happening today. There's even talk now that Pennsylvania is going to be the land of plastics manufacturing. And I always think when I hear that back to that great line from The Graduate about plastics. Anyway, but because of all the, just one word, plastics, because of all the cheap natural gas that's coming from the Marcellus Shale. Aubrey Mcclendon isn't the pioneer of fracking. He's not the guy who figured out technologically how to extract oil and gas from rock that was really never meant to yield it. Most people agree that that distinction goes to a man named George Mitchell. And if you're curious, a Wall Street Journal reporter named Greg Zuckerman wrote a book called The Frackers about the technological pioneers behind this industry. But McClendon was the pioneer in what I came to see as the other essential part of the business, which was raising money, being able to get investors to put literally the tens of billions of dollars into this industry that it requires. Aubrey Mcclendon himself, with typical immodesty, once told Rolling Stone, to be able to borrow money was almost as important an insight as horizontal drilling. And so these are some numbers I put together on Chesapeake that I think are really telling. From 2001 to 2012, Chesapeake sold $16 billion of stock and $15 billion of debt, and paid Wall Street more than $1 billion in fees, which isn't incidental, because whenever anybody says, why is Wall Street willing to give a company money, other people's money, I always say, look at the fees they're getting paid. That was just what was public. In less obvious ways, Chesapeake raised at least another $30 billion by selling assets and, dare I say it, doing these Enron-esque deals in which the company essentially got loans up front that were repaid with the sale of natural gas. And so it gets to one of the other reasons that I wrote this book. I'm always fascinated when the economics are at odds with the story. And what I mean by that is that the story of shale, and you read it all the time today, is that it's changing the world, it's going to give us American energy independence, and yet the economics of the business don't work. And so this source of mine, who said that Aubrey Mcclendon was the most important man in America, would tell me he would have this debate with his partner. And his partner would say, the oil and gas are real. America is producing all this oil and gas. Those aren't made up numbers. And my friend John would say, yeah, but the numbers don't work. And so I used Chesapeake and Aubrey Mcclendon as the pivotal story in my narrative, because Aubrey is so emblematic of this dynamic in the fracking industry. His company, Chesapeake, raised all this money, but never produced any free cash flow, never. And for those of you who aren't finance people, think of free cash flow as the essential element of what a business is producing, what the business can live on without having to go out and raise more money from more investors, what a business can live on without, in effect, being a Ponzi scheme of sorts. And this is true overall of the industry. So a finance guy named David Einhorn in 2015 went public with this presentation, basically lambasting fracking companies as financial hucksters. And his firm had looked at the financial statements of the 16 largest publicly traded fracking companies, and he found that from 2006 to 2014, these fracking companies had spent $80 billion more than they had received from selling oil and gas. Even when oil was priced at over $100 a barrel, none of these companies generated free cash flow. In fact, in 2014, when oil was over $100 a barrel for the better part of a year, the group burned through $20 billion. So I quoted a finance guy saying, the industry has a very bad history of money going into it and never coming out. And the numbers haven't changed much. At the end of 2018, the Wall Street Journal published an analysis, and the 29 companies in the journal's analysis had spent, listen to this number, $112 billion more in cash than they generated from operations over the past decade. And the financial predictions for the fracking industry remain pretty bleak. So you'll read these stories. If you read about fracking, you'll read these stories saying about executives of these companies saying the break even is now $30 a barrel, $40 a barrel. We can make money no matter what the price of oil is. But it doesn't translate to the bottom line. You go and look at their financial statements, and the companies are losing money. And I'm fascinated by this because the two narratives never converge. Nobody points out, wait, what? How can they be saying that they're making money at $35 a barrel if the company itself is making no money? And we'll come back to that. But so in the oddest ways, there's this direct link between the financial crisis of 2008 and the rise of fracking. And the reason is that after the financial crisis of 2008, the Federal Reserve slashed interest rates in order to stimulate the economy. And because the Federal Reserve slashed interest rates so dramatically, that enabled companies that depend on debt, that need to raise debt to fund their operations, to be able to raise the mammoth amounts of money that they need. And that directly led to the rise of fracking. And so I quoted a researcher at Columbia University who wrote a piece, and he said, the real catalyst of the Shale Revolution was the 2008 financial crisis and the era of unprecedentedly low interest rates that it ushered in. So most people think the key ingredient in fracking is chemicals, the chemicals that get pumped into the ground. I think the key ingredient is capital. And so my book focuses not on the environmental issues, but rather on the financial issues, partly because my book is a mini book and there's only so much you can cover in 30,000 words, but also because I'm a little bit cynical, and I think there's some truth to the notion that money rules the world. As long as we need non-renewables, and there's obviously a big question being asked at this conference and elsewhere about how long that will be, I don't think environmental concerns are ever going to stop us from fracking. What will stop it is if the money stops flowing. And the industry is far more fragile than most people think. In 2014, there was what some saw as a concerted attempt to kill the fracking industry when at OPEC's annual meeting that fall, Saudi Arabia refused to cut production. And the idea in Saudi Arabia was that this would push oil prices further down, thereby wreaking financial havoc on America's fracking companies. And it did. By mid-2016, American oil production had declined by nearly 1 million barrels a day, and some 150 oil and gas companies had filed for bankruptcy. I'm actually convinced that the bust is part of why President Obama overturned the ban on exports, because suddenly after the bust, people kind of stopped paying attention to fracking because everybody assumed it was going away. And so when the ban on oil exports, which is a really big deal, we in this country had a ban on exporting oil dating back to the 1970s. It's a 40-year ban that persisted through Democratic and Republican administrations, even though it flew in the face of what is supposedly, and I say supposedly, our free market economy. And so the ban on exports the repeal of it got tucked into the 2015 year-end omnibus spending bill. And if you weren't somehow invested in it, you probably didn't even know it happened. I talked to the lobbyist who worked on its repeal, and he said, the legislation passed the House and then the Senate before noon. By early afternoon, Obama signed it. Everybody left town for the holidays. Nobody was left in Washington. And this guy who had worked on overturning the export ban for like 20 years was like, I'll go out for a steak in a Manhattan by myself. I have nobody to celebrate with. So everybody thought fracking was over. And when Aubrey Mcclendon died in the spring of 2016, it was like the punctuation mark underscoring the end of the boom. It was the end. But like the proverbial phoenix from the ashes, shale didn't die. The industry came back stronger than ever, and America is now producing more oil and gas as a result of fracking than we ever have. And believers argue that this proves the skeptics who have questioned the industry's financial underpinning is wrong, and I don't think it's that simple. A big part of fracking's resurgence is this area of West Texas and southeast New Mexico known as the Permian Basin. It wasn't a secret that there was oil in the Permian. The Permian has long been America's most prolific oil field, but it wasn't until 2010 that people began to frack there. And the former CEO of one of America's biggest fracking company has said that the Permian could hold 75 billion barrels of oil, second only to the legendary Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia. Believers also say that technology is going to dramatically reduce the cost of fracking wells, basically reshaping the financial firmament so that companies can make money even with low oil prices. And that might be one humbling aspect of trying to write about energy markets, is that you quickly realize anybody who's tried to predict the future of energy has mostly one thing in common, which is that they've been wrong. So I stayed away from making big bold predictions. But the main reason that fracking has come back and remained strong is because interest rates have stayed so low and the capital has kept flowing to the industry. The most important thing fueling the industry today is the same thing that started it, which is the availability of money. And one source of money that people don't think about often is private equity firms, which are a huge source of capital in our economy today, mainly because pension funds in the era of low interest rates have been unable to make the kind of returns they need to pay for retirees. Pension funds have increasingly been given their billions of dollars to private equity firms. Private equity firms have in turn been giving those billions of dollars to fracking companies. And so I start one section of my book with the story of these two guys named Cody Campbell and John Sellers. Campbell was a football player who played for the Indianapolis Colts. He and his buddy Sellers were high school buddies. They worked in real estate selling subprime mortgages until the 2008 financial crisis. And then they went out and started to put together packages of land deals in the Permian Basin. They were backed by a big private equity firm, and they ended up selling the company they created to another major fracking company for $3 billion. So yes, they did well. And private equity firms also have lots of ways to make money, even if the industry as a whole doesn't. But there are some signs, I think, that this is coming to an end. The stocks of fracking companies have done terribly in the last year and a half, essentially, and that's because investors have started to say, wait, show me the money. You guys were supposed to be producing profits by now, and you're still not. There was a headline recently in the financial press, frackers face harsh reality as Wall Street backs away. They're increasingly unable to sell the equity and debt that they need in order to fund their operations. Even the most highly respected firms, a company called EOG, which is actually a spin-off from Enron, it used to be called Enron Oil and Gas, oddly enough, say that they actually can only produce a limited amount of money even when oil is $50 a barrel. And I went to talk to the CEO of EOG because I wanted to hear what he said about the fracking boom. And he thought there was less good geology, less good acreage out there than most people thought. And he said the Permian Basin is amazing, but the expectations of the Permian Basin are overblown. And so the Wall Street Journal has been doing some good investigative work on what the real numbers of fracking look like. And one they found out is that oil wells aren't producing as much as was forecast. The journal analyzed over 16,000 wells and found that 2/3 of the projections for what these wells would produce, projections made by fracking executives who wanted to see their stocks go higher, were overly optimistic, and that collectively the companies were on track to pump nearly 10% less oil and gas than they had forecast, and that's the equivalent of almost 1 billion barrels of oil and gas over 30 years. And so the journal's findings suggest that current production levels may be hard to sustain without greater spending, because operators are going to have to drill even more wells in order to meet growth targets. And shale operators are being pressured to spend less money rather than more money. There was another headline from the Journal about how frackers that were chasing fast oil output were on a treadmill, and that many fracking companies had been managing their wells to produce in the short term as much oil and gas as they possibly could, but they weren't managing their wells for the long term, and this has long-term consequences for the future of the supposed American energy boom. Companies have been able to show a lot of short-term early growth, but they may not be able to sustain that growth over the long haul. The CEO of a company called Schlumberger, which provides equipment to the fracking industry, said basically an increasing percentage of the new wells that are being drilled have to be drilled in order to offset the steep decline from the existing base. And so to me, the real question about the shale revolution is this. When I wrote my book, I did an op-ed for the New York Times, and the Times put a headline on it saying that fracking was going to be the cause of the next financial crisis. And I thought, well, not exactly that. But the real question to me is actually more existential. If companies had to live within the cash flow that they were producing, how much oil and gas would America actually be producing? The numbers would be significantly smaller than they are today. This thing called the fracking boom, the shale revolution, wouldn't look nearly as much like a revolution as it does like a whimper. I also came to believe, though, more broadly, that this whole concept of American energy independence, which president after president has cited as the reason for trying to maximize American oil and gas production, is something of a fraud. And at its grandest, American energy independence means we don't have to pay attention to ugly places in the world like the Middle East, because we can produce all of our own oil and gas. So basically, screw the rest of the world. America is independent. But if this was true back in the 1970s, when the Texas Railroad Commission could set the price of a barrel of oil, it's not true today. The price of a barrel of oil is set globally. It's determined by events all around the world, which are completely outside of America's control. And the idea that we can produce enough oil in order to impact the price of a barrel of oil in a meaningful way just isn't true. We can't go back to the 1970s. Even more than that, even if we could produce enough oil to meet all of our needs, and even with the fracking revolution, we're a long way away from doing that. We live in a global economy now. Our trading partners in Asia depend on oil from difficult spots in the world like the Middle East. And I found this analysis fascinating, done by a guy named Anthony Cordesman. And he had analyzed the most recent U.S. Census Bureau data and found that 6 of the top 15 U.S. sources of imports, including imports that are needed by our high-tech industry, are Asian states that in turn are heavily dependent on oil from the Middle East. So this idea that we could somehow, that this notion of energy independence is completely fraudulent. And the idea that we're trying to maximize our oil and gas production in the name of a concept that is meaningless in today's economy, it struck me as screwy, to say the least. Lastly, the era of renewables and the end of oil is coming. I was struck in meetings with a handful of smart money people who try to think about this. And the question they're all asking is, when will we see the end of oil? Because at that point, the price is going to go into a secular decline, and it's never going to recover. There's very little agreement on what exactly that date will be, but it's coming. And I worry that America, by focusing on this mythical or fraudulent concept of American energy independence, we're sort of pounding ourselves on the chest for being leaders in the world as it was, and missing our chance to be leaders in the world as it's going to be, as other companies leapfrog us in renewable technology. I was also struck, and this is what I meant when I started my talk and said that my own views on this shifted as I worked on my book. I had heard, as I was reporting my book, that Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's famous sidekick, had views on American oil and gas. And I thought, well, if you can get the chance to talk to the 93-year-old and absolutely brilliant Charlie Munger, you better pick up the phone and call him. So I did, and I spent some time on the phone with Charlie. And he made an argument, a conservation argument to me that rung very true to me. And he said, for all the worries about energy security, food security is every bit as important to the future of a country. And at least where we are today, there's no substitute for for non-renewables in fertilizer. And he said part of the reason the U.S. can feed its population is because yield per acre has increased so dramatically in the modern era. But that's in large part due to fertilizers, which are made through the use of hydrocarbons. And Charlie Munger said, we need to eat as far out as you can see. It's a serious problem, and I think hydrocarbons as chemical feedstock are probably irreplaceable. Maybe solar will work somehow, but we need a new technology that doesn't yet exist. And so he said, in my view, hydrocarbons are like the topsoil of Iowa. You wouldn't want to use them as quickly as possible. You'd want to use them as slowly as possible. You'd want to keep them in reserve in case we need them at some point in the future. Why are we drilling frantically, selling as fast as we can, exporting our oil and gas, only to leave ourselves potentially with nothing at some some date in the future where we may wish we had held those in reserve. So on that note, I wanted to open it up to whatever questions you have. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, and I'm happy to talk about anything you all are interested in. I spoke fast. Go ahead.
Well, I'll take responsibility if she spoke too fast for you all. But now is your time to ask clarifying questions. We have about 15 minutes to do so. So if you just raise your hand, I'll walk around. And if you're long-winded, I'll cut you off.
Thank you for your presentation. I would like to know your view on putting a fee on fossil fuels and returning that fee as a dividend back to households across America to speed up the transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to one based on renewable energy.
That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought deeply about the ramifications of that, but I'll answer your question in a slightly different way. It was really interesting to me in reporting this book how often I heard, well, renewables are only competitive because of subsidies. And for one thing, that's not necessarily true. Apple, for instance, just built a giant wind farm in Iowa, and when they were asked why they did so, the Apple people said, well, because this is what makes the most economic sense. We're not actually trying to be environmentally friendly. This wind is actually what works. But when I started to think about the implicit subsidies that the oil and gas industry gets, that's when I started to question this idea that renewables somehow are subsidized and oil and gas is not subsidized. And what I mean by that, there are explicit tax breaks that oil and gas gets, but there are also other subsidies. When you look at the Permian Basin and you look at the incredible use of water that fracking requires, who's bearing the cost of that? All of us, right? You look at the environmental and the health costs of fracking, and my friend Eliza Griswold wrote a great book called Amity and Prosperity, which just won the Pulitzer Prize, detailing the very real health costs that fracking has imposed on communities where it's taking place. Who's bearing the cost of that? And then there are people who are doing really, really interesting work about the environmental liabilities and the giant, basically just the stranded equipment, the stranded assets that are going to be left behind when the era of oil and gas comes to an end. And it's hundreds of billions of dollars in cost. And especially right now, the U.S. is rushing to build these facilities that are going to, so-called LNG facilities that are going to enable us to liquefy natural gas and sell it overseas. And that's a whole another topic of discussion, which we can get into if you want, about how real that is. But if fossil fuels go away, who's going to bear the cost of these stranded billions upon billions of dollars in facilities, all of which are getting tax breaks? So I don't know about returning it to Americans as a dividend now. I almost feel that that's, in some ways, maybe more of the same short-term thinking that that is such a problem in this country, but maybe putting it as a dividend for the future to absorb some of these immense costs that are going to be left behind. But something should happen. So I'd have to think more about what should be done with that kind of a tax. But from where I sit now, I'm all for the tax.
Thank you very much for coming and for your work. As I understand, one of your basic conclusions or findings is that this industry is not earning money, it's not earning profit. Okay. So I'll look at your material, but is there one other author that you respect who has reached the same conclusion in a magazine article? Or another book that you could also share that person's name with us, and then I'll look at both of your works?
That's interesting. I'd say there have been more. I think my book is the only one that has. My book is the only one that is a book that has tackled this issue, and my book is fairly nuanced on this point because, as I mentioned, I became very wary of making any grand predictions about the industry because people have mostly been wrong. And there is this argument that technology is going to change the cost of fracking, thereby making it possible to make money where it hasn't been. But that has not happened yet. What I did do in my history as a journalist is 20 plus years of writing about business plus years spent in banking. And so what I did do was talk to many people on Wall Street who are skeptical of the industry for exactly that reason, that it doesn't make money. And these are not people who are particularly invested in the environment in one way or another. In other words, they're not people who set out as environmentalists and then say, let's go get the fracking people. These are people who set out by looking at numbers and analyzing numbers and say, wait, these companies as investments don't make sense because they don't make money. So I found them about as unbiased a source on this as you could get. And it's not, the notion that the industry doesn't make money cannot be disputed. That's just the financial statements of the industry. It's not that's not a debate one can have. You can have a debate that it might make money in the future. You can have a debate that the capital might continue to be there. But you can't have a debate that it does not make money today, and that right now it depends on the infusion of tens of billions of dollars of fresh capital each year. And the reason for that, for those of you who are technologically interested, is that the decline rates on fracked wells are much steeper than the decline rates on an old school vertical well. So it used to be that if you drilled a well, the thing would keep producing oil and gas for a long time. If you frack a well, it produces most of the oil and gas that it's going to produce in year one. So, and the decline rates are in the 60, 70, 80% range in subsequent years. So if you're a company and you need to keep producing more oil and gas every year in order to keep your stock price up, it means you need to keep reinvesting billions of dollars in order to keep your wells producing, because each one immediately starts to decline dramatically. And there have been, as I mentioned, there's been some good investigative work in the Wall Street Journal and some headlines that have actually, since my book came out, made me more skeptical rather than less skeptical, because the headlines would imply that the problem is getting worse and not getting better. And even though the industry promised that it would become cash flow positive and that it would begin to make money, all the analysis and the numbers thus far are going in the other direction, and showing that it's going to be more difficult to make money than people thought, rather than easier to make money. But I think the real tell is going to be in the next couple of years to see, as Wall Street becomes more skeptical and stops providing money to these companies, what happens. What happens? Do the production rates stay high? Does it turn out that the fracking revolution can be sustained, or do the production levels start falling off dramatically?
Hi, thanks for covering this topic and doing this book. I was a long follower of the oil drum before, where a lot of this stuff originally started to at least come into the public's realm. So one question I have for you. Essentially, you're arguing that we've got this massive misallocation of capital into natural gas. And one of the side effects of that is natural gas electricity is now cheaper than coal electricity, right? So we're basically starkly looking at the destruction of the coal power sector is really a side effect of misallocation of capital. So what do you see going forward for the coal industry as this allocation actually gets more efficient and correct?
That's fascinating, and I'm not sure it will. And then there's so much in that question. But yes, so when President Trump says that the Obama administration or environmentalists killed the coal industry, it's not true. What killed the coal industry is fracking. It's the era of cheap natural gas that then led to that made it more economic to build power plants fueled by natural gas than to build power plants that were fueled by coal. And that's what has killed the coal industry. Once you've built a power plant, you're locked into that source of supply for decades. So I don't think natural gas is going to go away any soon. There is an argument, before I come back to the environmental argument, there is a financial argument that oil and natural gas are very different. Fracking for oil is, I think, I would bet uneconomic. The decline rates on fracked oil wells are much steeper than the decline rates on fracked natural gas wells. And there's a real debate about how much oil we actually have in this country that's economically viable. And in no way, shape, or form is the U.S. a low-cost oil producer if you look at the cost of our oil vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Natural gas is different. There's an argument that even with very low natural gas prices, natural gas fracking is closer to making sense economically, and there's pretty widespread agreement that we really do have a really long-term supply of ultra-cheap natural gas in this country. So then that gets into the environmental question: is this a good thing or a bad thing? And there's long been an argument that natural gas is a bridge fuel, that it's much cleaner than coal, its carbon emissions are much less, and that this is a good thing from an environmental standpoint. There's an argument that it's a terrible thing, that the release of methane from natural gas fracking is much more dangerous for the environment even than the release of carbon. And then the question for me is, how much could the industry control methane release if they had to? If they were forced to do so by regulation, could they contain methane release if they had to? And that I don't know the answer to. I think they could do a lot more than they currently are.
Just a quick question about the externalities that you've already enumerated to some extent, but I'm wondering, beyond the ones you mentioned, to what extent are the seismic externalities of fracking likely to get that goat? I mean, I don't know because I don't live in Oklahoma, but my sense is that there's some serious increases in seismic activity. It seems like an externality that might mobilize people more than others.
Yeah, so the fracking, I think, is linked to earthquakes in Oklahoma. It's a local phenomenon rather than a widespread one. So most of the oil that's coming from fracking today is coming from the Permian Basin, and there's such a plethora of natural gas that producers are actually flaring their natural gas, burning it into the environment rather than even trying to capture it, because natural gas has almost become a useless byproduct, which I think is somewhat shocking and horrifying. But there's not an earthquake argument in the Permian, so I think that it will remain a relative. I don't think that will be what ends the era of fracking.
This is probably our last question.
Thank you. Oh, pressure's on. All right. So I'm aware you've spoken at a number of real mainstream finance organizations. I saw you spoke at the CFA Institute in February of this year in Minneapolis. How deeply is the message that you're conveying here being heard in mainstream finance circles?
That's a great question, and I would have to say that it's not particularly, but I'm not sure there is such a thing as mainstream finance. So let me think through that and answer that in a couple of different ways. So the world of finance is kind of broken into skeptics and believers for the most part. Believers are those who believe in the story of American energy independence, of the Shale Revolution. There's a whole skeptical component of the finance world, the people, mainly people who are so-called short sellers, who are betting stocks who are going to go down, who I alluded to, who have done all this work about the financial underpinnings of fracking and think that the industry doesn't make sense. So there certainly is, if I look at my Twitter feed, I'd say there's about a bunch of the people who I follow and who follow me and who talk to me regularly are absolutely in agreement on this issue, but I'd say that it's probably not the mainstream view. And I am still struck when I read pieces about this divergent narrative. It's almost as if the two narratives run in parallel tracks. So you read a story about how the Shale Revolution is reshaping geopolitics and companies are making money at $35 a barrel and the break-even price is this and, American energy independence. And it never ever mentions the fact that the industry doesn't make money. And then you'll read another piece in the Wall Street Journal about, a piece of really good skeptical analysis about how wells are producing far less than they were forecast, and companies are perhaps front-loading their wells to produce as much as possible in order to juice their stock prices. And that never attempts to grapple with the narrative of American energy independence. And so it's as if these two narratives just run in parallel tracks. And what I tried to do in the book was tie them together and say, well, what does this narrative mean for this narrative? But there's very little of that. And I think some part of this is that Wall Street itself has just become a very short-term machine, right? And you saw that in the subprime crisis. People say, well, why would Wall Street be funding this industry if it doesn't make money? And I say, look at the financial crisis. Wall Street in recent years does not have a great track record of putting its money or other people's money into things that are necessarily great for the economy, let alone for the environment, or into making capital allocations that are really meant for long-term success. I think it's become an increasingly short-term oriented machine. And so everybody looks at the production numbers and says, this business is growing. Look, we're producing more oil, we're producing more gas. And they kind of put aside the fact that the economics, that it's still very unclear whether the economics work. So thank you all for listening to me. I hope you have a lovely time here.